Okay, I had the question about constructive criticism and motivation. That was one of the topics that was suggested, and I'd like to take a minute just to address some of that. This is a very interesting topic. Uh, for one, constructive criticism is an interesting phrase. It's one that always makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable, comfortable and uncomfortable at the same time. Because we talk about constructive criticism, I think the intent is to take a positive word and mix it with a negative word. The two different connotations. Constructive almost always sounds positive. Very rarely do you hear people talk about constructive things in a negative way. But criticism is something that we almost always see and interpret as very negative. And I think when they created that phrase, it was to the intent of trying to figure out how to blend those two things together. Essentially, it comes down to when I have something to say that I feel like needs to be said, uh, I'm starting to approach someone else's agency. This is where, now if I get into a theological or a gospel-based perspective, this is where, to me, this is a fascinating concept, because think about, if you try to study and understand agency better, I feel like that's a fundamental truth, a fundamental principle to be able to comprehend, to study, and to understand if you really want to be effective as a project manager or in leadership or in any kind of team. When you want to be a good team member, understanding agency is a very core principle, but it's a very deep one. At one level, we can say, yeah, we all believe in agency, right? But you understand within the church that we misunderstand that concept quite often. Some of the Quorum of the 12 was spoken on the difference between free agency and moral agency, and pointed out that even though in the church we talk about free agency, and outside of the church we talk about agency and freedom and liberty, and often we interpret that as meaning we can do whatever we choose. We can do whatever we want, and that's all there is to the story. And that's not necessarily wrong, but you'll notice that in the scriptures, you'll never find the word free agency, or you'll never find it as that phrase. You'll never find the phrase free agency in the scriptures. The term that's most closely used is either agency or moral agency. And the more that you study about that topic, the more you realize in the scriptures, when they use the term agency, it's never a situation where people don't have consequences, or that when we act and when we choose, we should always recognize that we will have accountability tied in with that agency. Yeah, you can choose whatever you want, you can do whatever you want, but we don't get to choose the consequences. So, now, I know the topic was constructive criticism, and I'm taking this in the direction of agency. I don't mean to just turn this into a Sunday school lesson or anything like that. I feel like this is a very relevant, applied topic. Now, if you put it into the context of a business setting or something along those lines, where you have a more professional relationship, typically the assumptions that play out in most cultures are that we keep a positive interaction with each other. That we don't typically try to criticize or tear down or turn anything into a negative interaction. When it comes to criticism, what's happening is, say for example, I have a coworker that I don't like the way that they run meetings. I may decide that they're so inefficient. I may be thinking this in the back of my head. They're so inefficient with how they run this meeting. They invite people to they ask questions that they never have answered. They wander around in circles. They let people go off on tangents, and we spend a lot of time not accomplishing much in meetings. I can say this because I've experienced this in my life, where I've had that feeling, where it started to grate on me a little bit, and I didn't like sitting in meetings with certain people that I knew were going to be in charge of running them, and I would like to have a constructive criticism session with them, right, where I'm going to sit down, and typically the idea is you're sitting down with this employee or colleague or supervisor, and you want to be able to open up. You want to be able to share openly what you think, what you feel, and you want them to be open to receive it. And so a constructive criticism approach typically says, okay, we're going to talk about some things that are friction points or rough points between how I see things going and how you see things going, and we've got to be able to work through this process. Well, if I understand agency well, I'm going to understand that there are boundaries to agency. There's only so much that I get to control in some other person. And in reality, I don't get to control them at all. I can try, and in the short run, I can control people, I can manipulate them, or I can set circumstances and rules and limits and incentives and punishments, rewards, whatever that is. I can set those things up, but they'll always be short term. I myself don't have control over anyone from an eternal perspective. And at the longest, I may be a manager of that person for their career. Maybe I can get 30, 40 years where I'm controlling certain parts of their life and how they interact and work. But in reality, I'm not really controlling that. That's an illusion. I can convince myself that, yeah, because they're my employee, I get to control their life. I get to control how they behave at work. I get to be in charge of their incentive systems and their bonuses and all those kinds of things. But in reality, you never get to control them. You can do your best to influence them through all of those mechanisms and through various others. Maybe I try to slander their name or try to demean or deface them in front of other people so that they'll, in the hopes that they'll behave in some certain way. But I think, again, if I start to understand the boundaries of agency, that's a key concept. To me, agency is loosely bounded. This is getting into complexity theory, and this is where I would say loosely bounded systems are all there are from a complexity theory perspective. Now, you can disagree with that. That's fine. I'm just trying to help you understand where I'm coming from as I make these statements. Loose bounded systems don't have concrete definition in their boundaries. Loosely bounded means that there will always be things coming and going from that boundary. Now, my interaction with any other individual person is a loosely bounded system. We have interaction with each other, some of which is open, some of which is closed, some of which we try to create boundaries and barriers emotionally and sometimes even physically. Sometimes we build walls and office space to create these boundaries that say, this is my space and that's your space, and these are my job duties and these are yours. And in many organizations, we have job duties that we define that way in order to create those boundaries. But in reality, as I interact with any one person, there are a million different ways that they can choose to interact with me. And there are a million different opportunities for them to interact with my world and to find ways to influence me and to influence my world. So, I probably should be drawing some pictures up on the board just to make this, just to illustrate this a little better. I'm not sure what to draw up there. So that's why I'm just sitting here talking at this point. When it comes to constructive criticism, I think one of the best mindsets to have is, instead of criticism, look at it as detailed analysis. And my paradigm that I try to take to this is that I understand that I will never have direct control over any one person or over any group of people. My approach to that is to take we're here together because we chose to. There are choices that we made that allowed us to come into interaction with each other. And at any point, the person on the other side can choose to change that game. They can choose to change the interaction that we're having with each other, the rules by which we interact with each other, the expectations and assumptions that we make. They can change those, and I can change them as well. So I try to take that mindset into the situation and try to create reasons and try to create mechanisms that give people reason to want to come back for more. And this is something that I'm not that good at, but that's my philosophy, is that if I create means and reasons and rationale and provide compensation and whatever it needs to be. I don't mean compensation in terms of money. I typically mean compensation in terms of if I give you something of value, if it's an idea, if it's a resource, if it's a relationship that I can help you create or develop, if I can give you something that you value, you're more likely to come back to me and we'll have a positive, open interchange and a positive, open interaction between the two of us over time. If I can create those bridges or those relationships in such a way where people feel like there is value in our relationship and that they can continue to expect to derive value from our interaction, that's one of the best things I can do to strengthen that relationship and make it something of worth and something of value. And as that builds, my perspective is I always try to leave the situation with a feeling of not that we are against each other or that there's a relationship of higher and lower, but I try to create a feeling and a relationship of we, of with, of togetherness, of unity. When I can create that kind of experience, or that we can create it together, we're more likely to have a positive interaction. We're both more likely to have a situation where we both walk away feeling benefited or edified or built up because of the interaction. Now, this is all setting a long introduction and framework to be able to describe how constructive criticism really becomes just an honest, open interaction where we're trying to explore what is our current relationship with each other, and we're trying to open up to identify not only what do we think the surface level of our interaction is, but what's also the friction points or the negative elements that we often try to hide from each other. We need to get to a point where we can open that up completely. Now, for that to function for me, I usually find that I have to put myself out there as the sacrificial lamb, so to speak, or the example, or that I have to volunteer to be the open and vulnerable one. I find that that's one of the best ways to help open up the person on the other side, is to basically say, listen, I know I have faults and weaknesses, and I try to pick them out, and I try to point them out, and I try to explain them and say, listen, I know I do this, and this probably bothers you, or that's a negative way to approach it. So I usually don't try to say the bother you part if I can. I usually just try to identify, this is how I approach things, this is how I do things weird, and as I look back on myself, this seems weird, or it kind of bugs me. If I can point out something that kind of bothers me about myself, it makes the other person much more open to realize, oh, this guy's serious about trying to explore what's really there, whether it's good, bad, or ugly. This guy's open to being able to explore that. So I try to build that in, and I try to have that kind of experience where we can discuss, hey, these are some friction points, or some icky points, or some yucky stuff, but I'm open to dealing with those. Yeah, there's going to be things that we don't like. There's going to be things that are imperfect in our reality, and the more that I can open myself up to that and show that and point it out, the more open the other person's going to be to opening up themselves. To be a lot of times I'll ask the question. If I volunteer something and that doesn't seem to be getting anywhere, then I'll ask the question, hey, and I'm trying to get better at what I'm doing, could you help me understand how I can make our interaction with each other better? Or what do I do that's just weird, or that seems off base? Or you can ask the start, stop, continue question. You can say, what am I doing that I should stop doing? Actually, let me do it in the right order. What's something I'm not doing that I should start doing? What's something that I'm doing that I should stop doing? And what are the things that I'm doing that I should continue doing? If you open up that kind of a framework, it's simple, it's accessible, most people will interact with that, and it opens up a good dialogue. if they don't interact with that, it usually means that they don't care about the subject. Oftentimes, they don't care about it at a level of depth to get to any degree of depth. That tells you something. But I like that pattern, at least for myself. It seems to open people up well, and we seem to have some pretty good conversations. Usually, like I say, I have to open up myself first. I have to identify the weird things that I do, and that's not as easy as it sounds. I've had to practice at that for probably about 5 or 6 years to get to where I'm more comfortable with it. But I am now. I can talk about myself and point out my quirks and my weaknesses, and I'm getting better at identifying them. Because I practice, I'm getting better at identifying what other people see in me that they may not like, or they probably don't like. But the more that I can discuss that openly, the happier things are, the better they become. So constructive criticism, I think, really should be reframed as an exploration of reality, an exploration of our interaction and relationship with each other, an explanation of how we can both grow from the interaction and the relationship that we have. That may sound squishy-feely. I don't hug people when I do this. I mostly just am trying to have an open, frank, honest conversation and use some mechanisms to help open up those channels. Now, as I talk to other people about it, I usually don't try to bring up anything that would be criticizing or negative. I try to approach, if there's something that I don't like, I try to approach it as a question and something that we can work on together. Usually that's a more open, inviting approach. And people don't even realize that you're bringing up something that bugs you. You have to just gain mastery and control over yourself to kind of reframe that argument or reframe that friction point or that criticism, to reframe it as a question that you're approaching and as an interaction between the two of you. It's more of a shared problem that way. You bring up something that is hey, what do you think about this? Or usually you have to go to layers and levels of abstraction for that to function. Instead of getting right down to the nitty-gritty, you do this and it drives me crazy, abstract it out a level or two and say, okay, how do we and our stakeholders approach, instead of a detailed thing, identify it as a more abstract thing. If somebody's always late, then you approach it as an abstract, not their particular lateness, but just ask a more general abstract question such as, how do we need to be able to meet the needs of our stakeholders, or how do we as a team function in terms of getting things done? How do we deal with time issues? If you approach it as a more general, how do we approach something in an abstract sense, such as how are things functioning in terms of time in our organization? That's an abstract statement. They can attack 100 different things. They can identify 100 different elements of how you deal with time issues in your organization, and you can slowly work around to the ones that to plans and methods that can help influence and improve the thing that is a friction point for you, the thing that you're finding that's not quite working for you. You can identify that through a more shared interaction. Anyway, there's probably a long way to deal with a short question. That's dealing with constructive criticism. I'll probably separate this out and deal with the motivation issue in a separate one, because this got a lot longer than I thought it would. So, thanks for your time, and away we go.